Recording in progress.
Dark dusky rockfish are not found in PFMC managed waters. The distribution for light dusky rockfish extends southward.
Jason?
Yes.
I'm sorry, but we had a technical problem here. I think we lost the hardwired internet. So we got the first 2 or 3 words and then it went blank. So we've been frantically going around trying to figure out what it was. So I apologize, but could you start over?
Absolutely. I noticed that my screen changed and I wasn't sure what happened. And I didn't hear anybody say anything, so I just kept on going. But I will certainly start over.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, I am Jason Schaffler, and I will be reading agenda item I-8A, Supplemental SSC Report 1, Scientific and Statistical Committee Report on Phase 2 Stock Definitions Scoping. The Scientific and Statistical Committee reviewed the following reports: Phase 2 Stock Definitions Scoping Document, updated schedule for developing the Phase 2 stock definitions, and literature review of life history aspects of 64 groundfish species managed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council. These reports describe the process for defining federally managed stocks and provide literature review results to inform stock definitions for species listed in the Pacific Coast Groundfish Fishery Management Plan. The literature review excludes stocks that were defined as a part of Amendment 31. The SSC appreciates the comprehensive review of information on genetics, larval dispersal, adult movement, and life history traits to inform stock structure for 67 species and 3 cryptic species complexes. Apart from minor suggested revisions, the SSC endorses the literature review as best scientific information available to inform stock definitions for use in management. Additional useful information on stock structure was often included in past stock assessments, and a more thorough review of historical assessment documents could provide additional information to inform stock structure decisions. Digitizing and uploading historical stock assessment reports to the Council website would facilitate full review of these documents for the purpose of stock definitions. Minor grammatical corrections and additional references were identified internally and made available for incorporation into the next iteration of the literature review. The SSC notes the following inconsistencies between the literature review and the Pacific Coast Groundfish FMP. First, dark dusky rockfish and light dusky rockfish are cryptic species with disparate distributions. Dark dusky rockfish are not found in PFMC managed waters. The distribution for light dusky rockfish extends southward into central Oregon, occupying PFMC managed waters. Thus, dark dusky rockfish should be revised to dusky rockfish should be revised to light dusky rockfish in the FMP. Rock sole refers to 2 cryptic species, northern and southern rock sole. Based on their distributions, southern rock sole should be specified in the FMP. Apart from relatively low abundances in the Puget Sound, northern rock sole is not present in PFMC managed waters. 3, Puget Sound rockfish was included in the literature review, but not listed specifically in the FMP. 4, on page 16 of the FMP, there is a footnote that reads, the category rockfish includes all genera and species of the family Scorpenidae, even if not listed, that occur in Washington, Oregon, and California area. The Scorpenidae genera are Sebastes, Scorpena, Sebastolobus, and Scorpenonotus. This language may need to be removed as part of the stock definition process. The classification of short spine thorny head and long spine thorny head as rockfish should be revised to thorny heads. A large number of species lack sufficient information with which to assess spatial population structure. For these, the Council may consider borrowing information from closely related species with similar distributions and/or life history traits. The general tendency for nearshore species to have greater population structure, combined with state-based differences in exploitation histories, could be justification to define finer scale stock structure for nearshore species when additional information is unavailable. For completeness, the SSC recommends combining results from the literature review that was previously conducted for Amendment 31 stocks assessed in 2021 and 2023 with all remaining groundfish species in the FMP for a single reference document. Another useful improvement would be a table that provides high-level summaries for each species and synthesizes information hierarchically. Such a table would promote among-species comparisons. It would also promote an evaluation of potential relationships between species habitat associations and the presence of stock structure. The SSC reiterates the need to periodically revisit the literature in search of new information related to stock structure. Doing so will be particularly important for stocks with conflicting or insufficient information. The SSC encourages use of the literature review for other council-related purposes, including the identification of ecosystem component species and state versus federal discussions. So the SSC also reviewed the estimation of recent groundfish catch distributions between federal and state waters off the U.S. West Coast, estimating groundfish catch distribution across state and federal waters in recreational fisheries, and exploration of 2 fishery independent surveys to inform groundfish stock distributions between federal and state jurisdictional waters off the U.S. West Coast. The SSC received presentations from Sean Madsen and Keely Kent from the NIMS West Coast region on the above topics. Eric Ward was available to provide additional information on some analytical aspects of these reports. The SSC appreciates the considerable amount of work done on this topic and has the following recommendations. The SSC finds the approach to stratifying by sector and summing to be appropriate given different levels of observer coverage across sectors. For sectors with incomplete observer coverage, an evaluation of potential bias between observed and unobserved trips would be helpful to ensure that the data used are representative. Logbook data could be helpful in this analysis. The nearshore live fish fixed gear fishery was not separated from the rest of the nearshore fixed gear fishery in this analysis, and a potential for differences between these fleets should be explored. The SDM-TMB modeling package, which was used for survey data, could be used to model catch location using location-specific observer data. Washington closed state water to all commercial groundfish gears in 1999, so small amounts of fishing identified as occurring in state waters likely reflect reporting errors. The analysis of recreational data is still very much in progress. The information most readily available to assign recreational catch to federal versus state waters varies greatly among the states. California has a grid system for assigning location used by the commercial passenger fishing vessels, as well as angler-reported fishing areas for private boat fisheries, which allows for estimating the relative distribution of fishing activity in state and federal waters in most cases. Oregon has bottom depth information, and the 3 nautical mile line is adequately approximated by the 30 fathom line. Washington does not have similar information to easily apportion catch between federal and state waters. The SSC recommends that analysis should include alternatives removing 2020 data that may not be representative of surrounding years, and including 2023 data, which in California is different from previous years due to changes in where recreational fishing took place. Both California and Oregon have data from onboard observer programs for the CPFV sectors of recreational fisheries that can provide more robust information for future analyses using data that is more reliable than angler self-reported data. These data sets have been linked to habitat data layers and used to develop relative abundance estimates to inform stock assessments. The SSC recommends that these data be considered for future analyses to better refine distribution estimates, particularly for stocks that have high catch in recreational fisheries and for which more simplistic analyses do not lead to clear conclusions regarding their distribution. The SSC reviewed analyses of catch in federal versus state waters for the West Coast Bottom Trawl Survey and for the Southern California Bite Hook and Line Survey. Neither survey covers all habitat and depths, and therefore auxiliary information is needed. The trawl survey does not cover areas shallower than 30 fathoms and does not sample rocky habitat. The analysis could be expanded to consider habitat information, commercial species catch per unit effort, and/or additional state and federal surveys that were not considered. Several recommendations for additional surveys that could be helpful were provided to the analysts. In California, the efforts of the California Seafloor Mapping Project and separate efforts to support analyses of essential fish habitat, combined with the bathymetry for the primary depth distribution of nearshore species from visual surveys or recreational fishing data, can be used to provide an estimate of the proportion of habitat in state and federal waters for comparison to catch. This can be beneficial to consider as catch is dependent on fishing regulations, which have become more liberal since 2018, but still do not allow access to all depths year-round. As suggested by the SSC in November 2023, habitat information could help inform many of these analyses given the strong habitat associations of many species. Habitat information can inform where the fish are likely to occur, which can inform to what extent surveys are encountering fish in federal versus state waters, as well as where fishing is occurring, particularly for recreational sectors. The Habitat Committee is likely to have insights for the use of habitat data as model covariates. It would be helpful to simplify the overall process. A helpful revision to the next iteration would be organizing all recreational and commercial tables by proportion of catch in federal waters, which would provide more clear information regarding which species and stocks are predominant in either state or federal waters. Additional data and analytical approaches are available to inform proportional estimates in federal and state waters. Exploring these for all species would be a large amount of work and thus a hierarchical approach to identifying where each stock falls is appropriate. This could start by identifying ecosystem component species based upon retention rates, estimated from onboard observer programs and other information. The next step would be to assign those stocks where the data clearly shows a predominant catch or presence in either state or federal waters. For the remaining stocks, additional analyses may be necessary. And that concludes the SSC statement. I am happy to answer any questions that come up.
All right. Questions for Dr. Schaffler on the SSC report? Oh, Lynn Mattis.
Thank you, Chair Pettinger and Dr. Schaffler. Did the SSC have any discussions about maybe some bias in using catch as a proxy for overall biomass and distribution? Just thinking, example, the recreational fisheries have had some pretty severe depth restrictions for most of the last 20 years, thus forcing catch into certain depths or certain areas. We've had large RCAs, which has prevented fishing from happening in those areas. Did you all discuss anything about that potential bias as compared to where the actual biomass is?
Thank you, Ms. Mattis, for the question. Yes, the SSC did discuss potential biases in these data with respect to the question you asked and several others. For much of the data, it was provided through the GMT and the GEM reports, which does include discard mortality. But you're absolutely correct that the depth restrictions that do occur, have occurred here, could certainly have a bias, and the SSC is cognizant of those. But we don't really have any strong recommendations on how to deal with that at this point, other than some of the other suggestions that came through the analysts.
Hey, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, I'm not sure how well the first time you read the SSC report went, but you knocked it out of the park in the second one.
Thank you.
All right. Next up will be the Abby Moyer and the GMT report.
Thanks, Chair Pettinger. Council members, this is Abby Moyer here to read agenda item I-8, the Groundfish Management Team Phase 2 Stock Definition Scoping. The Groundfish Management Team generally agrees with the three-step process in the order proposed by Council staff. The proposed schedule for Step 1, however, is likely untenable given the anticipated workload to support the identification of preliminary proposed alternatives for all Pacific Coast groundfish fishery management plan species. Due to the limited guidance and defined scope at this time, the GMT is uncertain about how to analyze the available data and if those data are sufficient for identifying species in need of conservation and management. There are 64 groundfish species remaining in the FMP that need to be analyzed to identify PPAs for stock definitions, and all FMP species will need to be evaluated to determine if they should remain in the FMP, be removed, or designated as ecosystem component species. The GMT is concerned the proposed timeline is untenable, and adopting a PPA in March 2025 would be rushed, potentially resulting in suboptimal decision-making. The GMT would like the Council to look at all remaining 64 species at once rather than taking a piecemeal approach for the remaining species to identify stocks in need of conservation and management. The GMT agrees with the overarching process identified as Step 1 in Attachment 1 and recommends the Council adopt a scope specific to Step 1 as well as a specific purpose and need statement for Step 1 and scope Steps 2 and 3 in subsequent actions. Step 1 in brief will determine if a species is to remain under federal management as a species in need of conservation and management. The revised National Standard 1 guidelines provide a framework that gives more guidance to councils on how to decide whether a stock requires conservation and management. The two criteria to consider when determining if a species is in need of federal conservation and management are: number 1, is the species overfished or subject to overfishing or likely to become overfished or subject to overfishing? And number 2, is the species predominantly caught in federal waters? If a species does not meet both these criteria, the Council should consider that species through the 10 non-exhaustive factors at Section 600.305C in federal regulations and any additional considerations that may be relevant to the particular stock. Regarding the first criterion to consider, to help determine if a species is overfished or subject to overfishing or likely to become overfished or subject to overfishing, the GMT recommends examining the current report to Congress on the status of U.S. fisheries and available stock assessments. However, that information is likely limited for a portion of species within the FMP. The majority of species in the FMP are managed within complexes, and a large portion of species currently managed in complexes have not been assessed and are Category 3 species without determined stock statuses. Additionally, species managed within complexes are also assigned annual catch limit contributions, which are not used in defining whether an individual species is undergoing overfishing. The GMT will need guidance on how to examine this aspect for species with limited information to no information on their population status. Additionally, the GMT will need guidance on what, if any, additional data may be used. Regarding the second criterion to consider, identifying whether species are predominantly caught in state or federal waters will need to be made for all species prior to determining stocks in need of conservation and management. The GMT is concerned that not enough information has been made available to determine predominance. Further, we are uncertain how to apply the available information to each species to determine predominance. To date, 3 analyses have been done to evaluate commercial, recreational, and federal survey catch data in order to support the determination of predominance by species. The Scientific and Statistical Committee reviewed the commercial fisheries analysis and determined that the applied approach of stratifying and summing the data was appropriate. While inroads have been made on recreational data, an approved methodology has not been established. The recreational fishery contributes a substantial amount to the overall mortality of many nearshore species, which will be the primary focus of determining predominance in either federal or state waters for these species. While commercial and recreational catch locations may be similar, this aspect remains unknown until there is a recreational analysis of catch locations for all 3 states. The third potential source of catch information was derived from the West Coast federal surveys. However, limited sampling within state waters by the West Coast federal surveys results in an incomplete picture of catch between federal and state waters. Furthermore, survey data does not reveal fishery-dependent information, nor where the fishery takes place, and therefore has limited utility for determining the predominance of catch. Finally, for species that do not meet both criteria, the Council should examine the guideline factors listed as Section 600.305C. In general, it is expected that these guideline factors are to be applied to species that don't meet both of the above criteria, and that may be considered as ecosystem component species or removed from the FMP. The GMT finds some of the guideline factors to be ambiguous and requests clarity from NMFS and council staff on their meanings. The rationale for this request is to ensure if and when species are analyzed by these guideline factors that they are analyzed in a consistent manner. Based on the GMT's review of the available information as provided in the briefing book, the GMT's initial impression is there are key data that have not been explored and could be critical to identify species in need of conservation and management. While the literature review described the biological information available for each species, fishery-related information was not provided. The GMT is uncertain if fishery-related information would facilitate evaluation of species and would like more guidance and assistance in determining what additional information is available and what other information may be needed to consider step 1. The GMT has identified some data gaps in the recreational and commercial fisheries that are elaborated on in Appendix 1 and proposes the Council direct the GMT during its overwinter analysis to fully scope the data needs and timeline and provide a report to the March Council meeting. PPA is currently set for March, and the team thinks this is untenable. The overwinter analysis will help better inform a more realistic timeline to be considered at the March Council meeting. In summary, the GMT thinks the proposed timeline to complete step 1 is not realistic. Currently, we have some biological and data from the literature review and commercial and recreational data. However, the GMT recognizes there are data gaps and is uncertain how to apply this information at this time. The GMT suggests the Council task someone to conduct a gap analysis and compile available data in order to have a report at the March 2025 meeting. Then, at the March 2025 meeting, the Council would review all available data that has been compiled or identified to determine if this information is sufficient to evaluate the first 2 criteria. The GMT recommends that the Council not adopt a schedule at this meeting, but reevaluate the timeline, additional data needs, and postpone adopting the scope and the purpose and needs statement specifically for step 1 in March 2025. When step 1 is complete, the Council can scope the timeline and purpose and needs for step 2 and 3. And that concludes our report, and I'm willing to take any questions.
Thank you, Abby. Questions for Abby on the GMT report? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Thank you, Abby. All right, next up will be Merritt McRae and the GAP report.
Good afternoon, Chair Pettinger, council members. I'm Merritt McRae, and I'll be reading from agenda item I8A Supplemental GAP Report 1, the Groundfish Advisory Subpanel Report on Phase 2 Stock Definitions, Scoping. The Groundfish Advisory Subpanel finds the purpose and need, scope, and process as described in agenda item I8 Attachment 1 to be sufficient. The GAP agrees that the schedule appears extraordinarily ambitious given the enormity and intricacy of the task. However, we stress that this process should be done in an expeditious manner so that staff capacity and council time can be spent on measures that are priorities for industry that will result in benefits to the fishery and seafood industry. To facilitate analysis, we request 1, a table of species-specific contributions as a percentage to the complex for each species within each currently defined complex, as required under National Standard 1. Quote, at the time a stock complex is established, the FMP should provide, to the extent practicable, a full and explicit description of the proportional composition of each stock in the stock complex, unquote. An updated report such as the agenda item E3A GMT Report 2 from November of 2021 would be helpful to inform decisions in advance of step 1. Additionally, this would support identifying those species which cannot be expected to be substantial contributors to the fisheries productivity of the complex and fishery. We expect that the table will be on the basis of either optimal yield or maximum sustainable yield productivity for the complex and each individual species. 2, the GAP requests a combined commercial and recreational average annual catch of each currently managed groundfish species in common units, for example, metric tons, so that we can see a quantitative measure of their relative contribution to the catch. The GAP understands there are many ways value may be assessed, other than by the weight or of the ex-vessel economic value of the catch alone. Within the guidance section, there are 10 suggested criteria to consider when determining whether a stock is in need of conservation and management. However, the GAP believes that an additional factor should be added to the list that considers the importance of access to the stock to West Coast communities. An example of this would be a stock that has a relatively low economic value, but could be an important source of affordable protein. The GAP will continue to be engaged on this topic. We agree with the guidance that factors beyond the fraction of a stock or catch occurring within state waters should go into the decision to remove a species from the FMP. And the fishing communities affected by these decisions should have input into those factors and decision points. Thank you, and that concludes the GAP statement.
All right, thanks, Barrett. Questions for Barrett on the GAP report? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes our reports. Takes us to public comment. I believe we have 2 before us. So first up would be Tara Brock, followed by Merritt McCray. So Tara. She online? Mary, I see your mic's unmuted, but we're not hearing you.
Apologies. I needed to click one more button.
Okay, we got you now, though. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Tara Brock with Oceana, but I'll also be speaking on behalf of Ocean Conservancy, Wild Oceans, and Earth Justice. Our organization submitted a letter under this agenda item outlining several recommendations and considerations for the council as you start scoping phase 2 of this stock definitions process. And as you move forward, we strongly encourage the council to consider the benefits of federal management and this process, including scientific and management resources, coordinated management efforts, and public engagement. As you've heard, while stocks that are predominantly caught in federal waters and that are overfished or subject to overfishing must be managed under a federal FMP, councils may also manage other stocks that do not fit within those 2 criteria. We therefore recommend the council retain management of all stocks currently in the FMP, as the council has the discretion to do so, and would note that the Magnuson constrains the council's discretion to stop managing stocks or delegate management to the states. As a preliminary issue, we recommend the council clearly describe the criteria for determining whether a stock is predominantly caught in federal waters and outline the procedure for monitoring and assessing changes in stock distribution relative to that standard. And if state delegation does appear at some point to become a viable option for some stocks, we recommend the council keep those stocks in the FMP to retain the ability to review the state's management efforts and take over management if federal standards cannot be achieved or maintained by the state. We are somewhat concerned that this process may be used to exclude stocks from management in a manner that is not consistent with the intent of Magnuson, including the use of ecosystem component species to avoid legal requirements and remove conservation measures. And we urge caution in any effort to remove stocks from the FMP or designate them as EC species, and ensure that all stocks continue to be managed in accordance with the law. We acknowledge the challenges of managing a very large number of species in this FMP. However, we are concerned that the stock complex system currently used to manage groundfish stocks is masking potential overfishing and is not providing an accurate picture of stock status for all stocks, which over time could lead to stock declines. By managing stocks together in a complex, there is a risk that some stocks may inflate the overall annual catch limit. Managing stocks in a complex structure makes it difficult to detect overfishing of an individual stock, and further makes it difficult to apply measures to end overfishing of a stock within a complex. In this process, we recommend the council address how overfishing of individual stocks within a complex will be detected and describe how individual stocks within a complex will be managed to ensure they can be assessed and their status accurately determined. In terms of process, we encourage the council to take sufficient time to ensure that the legal and policy implications of the council's actions are well understood, and that the GMT and others have time to provide the science and data for the council to make good decisions. Thank you for considering our comments. We will continue to be engaged in this process, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tara. Questions on Tara's testimony? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thank you. Next up is Merritt McRae. Welcome back, Merritt.
There is no PowerPoint. Good afternoon, Chair Pettinger, council members. I'm Merritt McRae, and I have hopefully a brief comment with respect to some of the questions that I heard this council ask earlier in this on this agenda item. I want to note that the council does have delegation or discretion to delegate management of that portion of a stock in need of conservation and management, which occurs in the federal waters that are adjacent to a state, so long as it represents less than half of the, excuse me, I got that all goofed up. The council does have discretion to delegate management of that portion of a stock in need of conservation and management, which occurs in federal waters, to the adjacent state, so long as it represents less than half of the fishery, following the guidance in section 600-305. Otherwise, the question is if in the global sense, a stock is in need of conservation and management within its natural range, and yet just a small portion of that stock exists in the EEZ, can the council and the National Marine Fisheries Service remove that portion of the fishery that occurs within the EEZ from management? So I think that's an important question to ask. And I'll note that there are many states that are many stocks that states do manage already that do occur also within the EEZ. Some of them are actually fish in the majority in the EEZ that might be considered for adding to those fish that are managed. I've pulled out a couple of excerpts from National Standard 1 that I think shed some light on this. And I'll quote, "The ACLs for state federal fisheries for stocks or stock complexes that have harvest in state and territorial waters, FMPs and FMP amendments should include an ACL for the overall stock that may be further divided. For example, the overall ACL could be divided into a federal ACL and a state ACL. However, the National Marine Fisheries Service recognizes that federal management is limited to the portion of the fishery under federal authority. When stocks are co-managed by federal, state, tribal, and/or territorial fisheries managers, the goal should be to develop collaborative conservation and management strategies and scientific capacity to support such strategies, including accountability measures for state and territorial and federal waters, to prevent overfishing of shared stocks and ensure their sustainability." And then a little bit further along in National Standard 1's accountability measures for state federal fisheries for stocks or stock complexes that have harvest in state and or territorial waters. Fisheries management plans and FMP amendments must, at a minimum, have accountability measures for the portion of the fishery under federal authority. Such AMs could include closing the EEZ when the federal portion of the ACL is reached, or the overall stocks ACL is reached, or other measures. This council and the National Marine Fisheries has evolved to provide for guidance and supporting scientific resources for many stocks for which the preponderance of the fishery occurs in state waters. And I'd like to point out salmon. This council manages salmon, which are even in ocean waters, I think predominantly caught within state waters and certainly within the rivers. There are nearshore stocks in the nearshore rockfish complex. And we've seen in the attached documents under this agenda item that many of those are found in state waters, and we've managed them. State management has evolved to depend on this council's and National Marine Fisheries Services science capacity and the coordination in managing these fisheries within our state waters and between state and federal waters. This has provided needed coordination of management measures between state and federal waters. This is a complicated subject, and I would actually suggest that you refer to Keely Kent or Todd if you have questions as to whether or not any of this is true or untrue. But I believe this, what I've stated, to be the case. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Are you done, or are you just pausing?
I am done.
Okay. just checking. All right. Thank you. Questions for Merritt on this testimony? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that concludes public comment. Takes us to our council action, which is before you. So, Keely?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make two remarks, one very specific and one more general. Ms. Mattis was asking a question to the SSC report, and I thought it was a thread maybe that I'll bring here because we did not present the three NIMS reports that looked at, one that looked at the commercial catch proportion analysis, one that looked at recreational catch, and then one that looked at surveys. And I'll try to paraphrase, although Ms. Mattis, please tell me if I got this wrong. Some of the questioning was whether or not catch is the appropriate way to think about where the fishery is and whether or not there is a signal we're missing from without looking directly at biomass. And I come back to, you know, in my presentation, we were talking about what the council role is. And it comes back to the fishery under its authority. And so we have come back to, we think catch is an appropriate way to look at where fishing activity occurs. That's not to say you couldn't look at species distribution or even something like habitat distribution. And we had a really good conversation in the SSC about that. But those then, in that situation, are proxies for where a fishery could occur. And so some of this, because, you know, it is very much in the first stage of what we're looking at, I think it's important to bring that thread through and just note that that's our perspective, that catch is going to tell you about where the fishery is, and you can recognize how that is limited based on regulation, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a stop, and we don't have to create, you know, more complex analyses. That could be enough, right? And I'm looking for those ways in which we can build a strong record without needing to go down a lot of different pathways and spend more time. So I wanted to just connect that thread. And my apologies to Ms. Mattis if I at all said something beyond what she was actually asking, but I wanted to put that out there. More generally, I just wanted to recognize, you know, this is a really challenging action. There is a lot here. I have had some really thoughtful conversations everywhere that I have went with my presentation and discussions. So I want to recognize, you know, we had some really good work in the SSC, excellent conversation in the GAP and in the GMT. I've certainly had a lot of hallway conversations about there is so much here and it feels challenging and overwhelming. But I come back to, I think we have a really helpful path forward that council staff and NIMS staff had laid out in front of us. And I think we've been clear that this is a top priority for us. We will continue to invest our resources to help guide this process. Recognize, got the sense the GMT was feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this. And I don't think this is something that the GMT has to lead us through. They have a role to play, but but NIMS and the council staff, I think we can lead us through this. And if everyone will sort of bear with us on their hard questions, but I really do think we can work through this without getting too spun out, and we'll keep chipping away at it. And so wanted to bring us back to maybe a sense of optimism that I know it's hard, but we'll get there and we'll work together on it.
Thank you, Keely. Executive Director Burton.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I share a lot of what Keely just indicated. We've talked internally as staff about this topic, and I understand the first time we go through it, it does seem overwhelming and complex. I can say that I've personally done this kind of work before, and once you wrap your arms around it, it's actually something we think about just about every day. It's not that different from what we do, and so we have staff set up, and I think we're working very well together, and we're prepared to help drive you through this action. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Marcy Aramco first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got to thinking, this question's for you, Keely, back to phase 1A, phase 1B. And in those exercises, we did not spend much, if any, time talking about whether stocks were in need of federal conservation and management. And I'm just wondering here in phase 2, why that seems to be such a point of emphasis. I mean, are we overbaking this? It kind of feels like the default answer is yes, they're in need of conservation and management. They're fisheries, or these are species that are the subject of a fishery management plan. I mean, I think there's work to do, obviously, in dealing with complexes and consideration of whether or not we really need all of these species to be actively managed under ACLs, and whether EC is perhaps a better designation for some of them. But I'm just wondering if in this first step, we're maybe going overboard in digging so deeply about trying to justify that stocks are in need of conservation and management. Like I say, we didn't do it last time. We weren't looking at survey indices for the species that we defined in phase 1. So maybe you can explain the need here. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcy. Keely.
Thanks. Yeah, all of this has been really challenging. I will say when this started, we were at a crisis point. So we, NIMS, pushed the council to make a quick decision on Amendment 31 because we were in a crisis point where the determination was made that we didn't have any stocks that had been defined as in need of conservation and management, and we could not move forward with the 2021 status determinations. That vaulted us more quickly than I would have liked into needing to act on those stock definitions. The point that we're at right now is pulling together some threads that have existed for at least 25 years, right? So like recently I went back to the groundfish strategic plan from the year 2000, and there's lots of things in there about the nearshore stocks and whether or not the council should actually be managing nearshore stocks because they do not occur much in federal waters. There's been many documents since then that have looked at that very question. We, at the point of Amendment 31, that lead up, right, we were in this crisis point of not being able to move forward with our management system without making that decision. So I'll take responsibility. We pushed the council forward, knowing there were these bigger issues that it didn't feel like we were ready to tackle in that moment. So yes, right now it's sort of challenging because we made some of those decisions without having these bigger conversations. I think it would be irresponsible to not have these bigger conversations. That's not presupposing an outcome, but it's saying these questions have been around for a very long time. And the council has had a couple of actions where they've looked at them, right? We never made it all the way down this line of really doing this true evaluation of these stocks in question. whether or not they're really in need of conservation and management. So in some ways, we're both responding to a crisis, but also saying this is the time to close those, to tie all of those threads together that have been around for a long time in this fishery and make a decision one way or the other and document it. Why did we do that? So I hear what you're saying, and I would just say we're not presupposing an outcome, but I think it is really important to do that true evaluation. Like we talked about before, there are species in this FMP that ended up there because a genetic study said there's a new species, not because the council ever evaluated it and said it needed conservation and management. So, all of those things, I think this is the right time. These issues are ripe to take them on and make that evaluation.
Marcy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Keely. That is super helpful context. And I think, at least for me, frames how I think about these next near-term steps. I have a more clear picture now, I think. And back to my comment about perhaps we're overbaking this. I guess I would ask, you see the GMT report, you just mentioned earlier the concerns they have and the feeling of kind of a lack of direction or clarity and how to proceed. And I guess I would just be hopeful that, and looking at the ambitious timeline, of course, an attachment to how much is enough? Because again, now that I'm thinking about this through this kind of new lens, it feels to me like the default answer, is where we are. And I appreciate our need to build the record, tie those historic strings together and do some cleanup here and fill in some missing gaps. But do we need 6 months to do that? Do we need a year to do that? I mean, I feel like, how much is going to be enough? I think if there's a way you can help us understand that, it certainly, I think, will shape our workload path forward and provide some clarity with, and how we balance the needs and accomplish the, it doesn't have to be the bare minimum, but, what's enough to get us over the finish line? Thanks.
Keely?
Yep, thanks. We are thinking carefully about what is a strong record without spending more time than we need to on this. The way that I envision it is we're going to be doing a lot of binning. So I certainly sense it's easy to get quickly overwhelmed when you think about the number of species, but I think we are going to be binning things that from the get-go we can bin. We've already done some of the, I'll call them like, these are definitely federal stocks, right? Like we have more of those and we can bin those and we don't need to spend as much time on those. I think we're going to end up with bins of here's ones that we want to investigate whether or not they're candidates for ecosystem component species. And here's ones where we really need to understand if any of the fishery occurs in federal waters, if so, what amount and how does that play into the stock. And so you're going to end up with these smaller amounts, and it's not going to be as overwhelming when you consider each bin separately, in my view. I will say we've had the opportunity, NIMS has been thinking about a lot of these things for a while now. And so I do feel like I can come in a little bit more optimistic. I knew that it would take some time for some of this to filter down and start to make sense, but I really see us chipping away at it. Right now, the schedule of looking at it in March and June makes sense to me from the ability to bring forward additional materials then. I'm not as held to we have to get to a PPA in March, but I think March is a time when we will have a lot more for the council. If the council gives us a clear scope on how to move forward, where it will have a lot more on the table to start doing that binning exercise and be really more clear about where do we need to drill down and where do we not. And that will help reduce sort of this sense of, it could be a lot of workload. So that's my feeling that, we can come back in March with a lot more for you. And then in June, I'm not as tied to that has to be PP and FBA, but that timing feels appropriate to get a good chunk and a good step forward. And certainly if council staff want to comment on the phrasing of what is March and June, we could get into that, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Keely. Heather Hall.
Thank you, Chair Pettinger. And I know several of our hands shot up all at once. So just want to acknowledge that I think Ms. Mattis and Ms. Kiefer are in line too. So I don't mean to jump the queue. Okay. Thank you. I'll just start out here. Keely, thank you for your opening comments. It's very clear that you've been through this enough to anticipate what is rolling through our heads, I think, and you did a nice job of addressing some of those thoughts just to get us started. And so thank you for that. I want to just start big picture, and I really appreciated Merritt's public comment. I was looking at the national standards this morning and how it relates to this issue. And I've been thinking, and we've been talking in our state delegation as we prepare for this in terms of the big picture. And not that I'm resistant to change, but why do we have to do this? And we speak a lot about the Pacific Council and how we manage our stocks and our fisheries in a way that I think we're all really proud of. And with that is a strong reliance on science and, trying to put, it feels like a little bit of trying to put this into a box that acknowledges state, federal jurisdiction, which is really messy. It feels like it won't fit. And so the more I hear, us talking about this, I think there's places where we can see how we are already doing this. We really do have a good approach to getting the science from our surveys and applying them to state management. We adopt rules that conform to federal rules, and our enforcement officers enforce, and we've had that collaboration. So when I get concerned about how big this is, I think about the places where it's working, and that'll help keep it going. Before I hand it over to the next, whoever has the next comment, I did want to acknowledge the GMT's report, and it feels like they're asking for help and feeling overwhelmed. And thank you again, Keely, for hearing that from them. And you did say that it's not squarely on their shoulders, and I just wonder how we can help them so that they can do something over winter and maybe not feel like they have to get to PPA by March, but what does that look like? And maybe throwing that out for everyone, but seeing if you and maybe council staff have ideas about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Lynn Mattis.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Pettinger. Was trying to answer Keely's question of me a few minutes ago. I think maybe a little bit of where I'm getting hung up is all of this is talking about where the fisheries are. And in my head, I'm thinking about where the fish are, which may be two different things. And that may be farther down the road. So I appreciate the discussion. Those are two slightly nuanced different things that we will have to look at. And since I have the mic for a minute, similar to what Ms. Hall just said, when I was trying to explain this action to my very new agency leadership, was asked, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? It seems like this is already working, and it's what we're already doing. And from the purely fisheries management regulation standpoint, I think it is. We, in the state of Oregon, also adopt federal rules by regulation or by reference. We do some minor tweaks in state rules for some flexibility, just to be a little more reactive. And that's what our director sees. This bigger piece about federal jurisdiction in need of conservation and management is a little harder to explain to her. And I think this discussion we've been having is helping build that record so I can go back and explain to her more of what we're talking about. On the agenda or the schedule, I think the steps and the benchmarks are appropriate. I've heard the dates on the schedule described as optimistic, ambitious, aggressive. If we do adopt that schedule, I think there needs to be some understanding that we are likely not going to hit all those benchmarks depending on other workload, how long things take, how, as we start digging into things, how complex they get. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is when we go into, I think part of this process is going to be probably looking at redoing the productivity and susceptibility analysis. I know I heard this on the GAP webinar the other day that having industry members involved in the susceptibility piece, I think will be important because they're the ones who are on the water. Data nerds, biologists like myself, we know the biology, we know the data, but people like Merritt and Jamie are the ones out on the water and know what's going on. So having them involved in the susceptibility part, I think will be very important. So thank you.
Elin? Mark Grelnick? Oh, Sharon Keefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mark. I'd like to kind of, again, with some discussion of the schedule, like to put a little finer point on that. So specifically underlying this particular schedule proposal, aside from wanting to get it done, and I certainly recognize that and that we need to do it. But aside from that, is there a particular law, litigation threat, related process that we need to stay in step with that was the basis for this schedule proposal? We're talking less than 12 months.
Todd?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Chair. Thank you for the question, Ms. Kiefer. So when we developed the schedule initially, we were looking at the impact that this particular decision would have on our harvest specifications management measures process. And so by doing this step one by June would set us up very nicely to move into the harvest specifications and management measures process. It's not, Ms. Kent would have to answer the question about litigation and that sort of thing, but it was mostly, again, just to front load the specs and not have a decision made in the middle of that could alter things. Thank you.
Keely?
Maybe if I could just add to that a little more. I appreciate Todd's answer. I will say we want to find the balance between giving this enough time, but recognizing that there are things happening on parallel tracks that have become more challenging because we have not addressed this. And so that keeps coming up, that in other actions, stock assessment prioritization, we said, well, what's going to happen over there? Stocks in need of conservation and management, that influences what stocks we're going to assess. Specifications has become more challenging because we haven't discussed and dealt with these issues. We haven't figured out what we're doing with our stock complexes. So we've had to layer on additional management because we had concerns about some of the mortality in those complexes. So that might not be the most efficient way, but that's a Band-Aid, right? So you're adding more Band-Aids that we've had to deal with, and that will continue to accrue. I'm expecting that some of these issues will come up under our EFH review because EFH flows from what stocks you've decided are in need of conservation and management. So we have to balance the schedule and moving forward with having enough time to work through these issues, but we're cognizant of other actions that are happening that are more complex, or we're concerned about getting out in front of our skis on a decision somewhere else that might have been different had we decided one way or the other under phase two. So recognizing this action is so fundamental to all of our groundfish management on the West Coast, it will be hard to not have these decisions be made and feel like we're moving forward in a very thoughtful way on other actions.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Mark Grelnick.
Thank you, Chair Pettinger. And thanks, Keely. It's unfortunate we find ourselves with an FMP that wasn't properly vetted, and it's good that we're getting to it now. It's a lot of work, as we've heard from the management team and others. And I'm wondering, it seems that there's been a lot of angst over how do we determine which stocks are predominantly harvested in federal waters. And I would submit that's not a critical question for us to answer, because what the national standards say is that it's non-discretionary. We must include a stock in the fishery management plan. if it's predominantly taken in federal waters. Even if the question is no, we then move on. This has been set forth in a number of reports. We then move forward with the 10 factors. And so I'm wondering how critical it is for us to answer that first question if the answer to the second question is much easier to answer. In other words, if there are factors amongst those 10 that suggest that we need to maintain our management of those stocks. The comments to the revisions to the 2016 amendments says that the final action clarifies that federal management is not limited to stocks that are predominantly caught in federal waters. To determine if other stocks require conservation and management, the guidelines contain a non-exhaustive list of factors that council should consider. So I'm wondering if we can, I mean, it's still going to be a lot of work one way or the other, but I'm wondering whether and to what extent we're getting hung up on the first question about predominance versus the non-exclusive list of factors. Now, certainly there must be some nexus to federal waters, I think, but it's not set forth in the in national standard guidelines.
Thank you, Mark. Keely?
Thanks. That's a good question. Sorry, I was going to try to pull back up the 10 standards. It's the second one that really, I think, is where predominance flows in. And we don't have to, I agree, we don't have to spend a ton of time on predominance. There's an ability to figure out how we want to weight things and look at it, but it is a factor to consider. And the one example that I would put out there is we want to be cautious of getting in a situation where you've determined that a stock is in need of conservation and management that you have no management authority over. And we are starting to see that in some situations where you have a stock that most of the fishing is happening in state waters, and that the management that you want to do, such as the closure, is not something that the council and the NIMS have authority over, right? That is not a great situation to be in. So that's an extreme. And I'm not saying that that is the only thing that we need to think about, but that's an example of how if you get out of step with understanding where your fishing is occurring, this council doesn't have any ability to actually influence the outcome of that stock. Or, you know, if it's rebuilding, you might not have any ability to rebuild it. The state could, and our states have been really great at taking management measures and conservation measures that are consistent with the council. That doesn't always have to be the case, right? And so that's just the possibility out there that I think we should think through of why we need to be careful about. It should be a stock that we have an ability to have an influence on, but it does come into that second factor in the list. How you want to order and weight things, I think you have some ability to tailor that in how you want to set up your decision making.
Mark?
Thanks for that, Keely. I guess I since predominance is that term is precisely used in another part of the regulation, I personally don't see that in the second factor there. And I think it would be helpful if there is some commentary somewhere that would help us, because I think that the comments in the Federal Register to these revisions make it pretty express that predominance is not a factor. But you're right, there is this, I mean, we can't go about in managing everything, right? We can't, there are a number of state managed species that we don't want to touch. But I don't see in national standard guidelines or in the comments to the national standard guidelines any definition for what degree of nexus we need to have. Is having some harvest in federal waters, or should we be looking at abundance? Because after all, I think, as was pointed out, the fishery has been prevented from accessing considerable stretches of waters in federal waters, largely the RCAs. And, presumably they're going to go away. I mean, they have largely gone away, and now we have other restrictions because of other stocks. But it's not an easy answer. But I'm just thinking if we can sort of skirt the question of predominance and look at these other factors, we might simplify the task before us, or not.
Executive Director Burton.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Gorelnik. You're touching on really something that I have in my mind as I'm listening to this conversation. That there are, in my experience in doing this kind of work, there are a variety of factors, and we're at a place here where we're talking conceptually about what our action might be and what the analysis might be, and that's hard to wrap your head around when you've got something new and you have a lot of potential factors. This is why we do analysis, right? So I think where we're at is making sure that we understand the question that's in front of us, and then understanding that there are a variety of considerations or factors that will help determine your decision. And the analysis will provide some clarity for you all when we get there. And so just, I guess, another personal reflection, not that I want to make this about me, but it has become very clear when I've done this kind of work before, what is in need of management and what isn't, as you go through that type of work. So all that is to say, just I appreciate your remarks, and I think you're touching on those factors as a very important part of this discussion.
Okay. Todd?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was waiting patiently in line, but this question is, or this statement will address Ms. Hall's question about what to do about the GMT and how to help us. So there's a number of ways that we could go about this. Obviously, we need a scope to understand what level of work we're going to be doing moving forward. The second aspect is that there are two avenues. One could be that once we have a scope at this meeting, we could come up with a list of tasks or ideas and bring that forth under workload planning, either under this particular meeting or in November, when we generally set sort of the agenda or the ideas that the team should be working on in their overwinter meeting. I have a few ideas, and most of those ideas at this moment based on the lack of information that we have surrounding recreational fisheries. And most notably with recreational fisheries, there are questions about location and spatial input. And some states have much finer scale, and then some states don't. And one key point would be to understand, in terms of the predominance question, what percentages are we looking at inside, outside state waters? So that is one thing that we will need input from the GMT, or at least specialized members in the GMT. So hopefully that doesn't confuse. Thank you.
RC.
Well, it may have confused me a little, so thank you, Mr. Chair. Todd, I appreciate your answer, and thank you for, I mean, we are striving for clarity here and how to guide our staff on the GMT. But I guess I would turn back to the exchange I had with Keely with regard to how much do we need in the record? Like, what's enough? Because this basic question of, what is the need of conservation and management and the 10 factors, I just have a difficult time believing that we're going to need a whole lot to justify that decision, because it was automatic in phase one. And I realize we need to tie up loose ends and provide documentation and a strong record of our decision making. But I would think that do we really need to go and explore more on recreational catch to justify? I mean, that's one piece of information out of one factor among 10. So I just am, I'm trying to think about, we want to meet the needs of the record, but I just am wondering if we're on a bit of a tangent here. Thank you.
Asia, Smolla.
Thanks, Chairman Pettinger. I'm wondering how far to go here with this comment, but one thing is to say that Similar to America, I've had experience doing this in the past, and there's actually there are a lot of examples around the country of different ways to do this. I was part of, in my time when I was working for NOAA, working with the Mid-Atlantic Council around river herring and shad, there when the agency was sued for, or actually it was a very strange lawsuit. The council decided not to list river herring and shad as stocks in the fishery management plan without doing a NEPA analysis of it. And then there was a lawsuit that was ultimately dismissed because there wasn't a NEPA analysis. So there was some justification needed and an analysis to decide and actually discuss whether it was a stock in need of conservation and management. It wasn't as simple as just the council saying yes or no in agreement on the floor, and it needed a NEPA analysis. But I also don't think it needs to be overboard. And my sense here is that for some things like what you guys did in Amendment 31, it's going to be really fast, what this council did with Amendment 31, it's going to be really fast. And then for other things, for many, probably for a handful of the stocks, there's going to be a lot more conversation and discussion. And that's where to spend your time and effort, not on the things that are like easy decisions. So what's really sticks with me is Keely's binning concept of like, there'll be rough bins and probably a lot more discussion around certain bins, but not so much discussion around other bins. And then the other thing that really sticks with me is what Merritt said is, and what came out in the gap statement is that like, this is a procedural thing that is important to moving other things moving forward, but I'm in favor of a really fast timeline for it because it's a distraction from the real work that we want to get done. It's getting in the way of doing real things. So I heard the GMT's caution about speed, but it seems like I would prefer to go real fast with this and like, let's get it done, get it out of the way. And yeah, Merritt's comment sat with me too, where he was like, look, there are all these other examples of different ways to do it. And I think here, coming in with a sense of optimism, like use your imagination and make the justification for your imagination. Not saying that it's like fluffy unicorns and rainbows here. There's like real data underneath it, but I think there's a way to do it without getting afraid of this task. So I'll stop there.
Asia, Keely?
Thanks, maybe I'll try to connect Ms. Yaremko and Todd's response. For the rec analysis, in my view, we have a couple of action items from the SSC and then captured in the GMT report, but then also in the GMT discussions with the state rec leads that are very much actionable and could move us forward quickly and not need much more. The one caution I'll throw is I think there's been a lot of discussion about the Washington data, and that might be a special case that we need to think about and look at. But what I have taken away from the meetings and recognizing that the council didn't get those reports and discussions, so it's a little, it feels a little offset, but to me, I left that feeling like we're in a good place. There's definitely some overwinter work, but we can move forward quickly. And I think at the end of that, we will then have a small amount of species that we would be focused for anything more. And I don't know that anything more is, but there's a possibility, right? That commercial is pretty much done. There was a couple additional suggestions from the SSC, but it's not much more work. Rec, that we have a strong path forward, and then that could be enough for most of our species. There might be a couple more that we want to talk about, right? But that's a lot smaller workload. And so I think sort of walking the line between, I see definite, we like some help from some of the GMT folks or the GMT as a whole, but it doesn't feel like a lot more or a nebulous path to me. And I've had more time, more opportunity to think about these things. And so that's the place that I'm at right now, that I see the path forward, and I want to keep working with you all to walk together down that path.
Corey Writings.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Kent, for that. I'm wondering if you can, in light of this conversation, go back and maybe give us a little bit more about what you meant by binning. I know you talked about that earlier and talked a little bit about it. I'm not sure that I fully understood at that moment what you were saying. So thinking about that, especially in contrast, I think it was the GMT statement that talked about wanting to take a holistic look at this and doing them together. So just trying to sort of reconcile or understand if they even need reconciling those two approaches.
Thanks. What I mean by binning is that again, because I've had the opportunity to be looking at some of the information that are in the reports in the briefing book thus far, is that I do think there will be groups of species where the answers are really clear. That just by looking at the analyses that you have thus far, that there's going to be a bin of species that feel very clear that they are stocks in need of federal conservation and management, that we don't need to spend a lot more time on. I think on the converse, there's likely to be a bin that we don't see any fishery activity in federal waters. Maybe that doesn't feel more clear to people, but that's what I mean by bins, that there's going to be divisions. And then there's going to be a gray area bin, right? There are ones that are straddling stocks, or that we have conservation questions about, or that we've been managing for a long time, but still are a lot in state waters. Those ones that you have a question mark on, that's where you're going to spend your time and energy. So that's what I mean by binning, in that I think there will be some clear answers for some groupings of stocks, but different answers, right? So they're going to be in different bins. And then there are going to be some where it's just really clear that we need to spend a little bit more time on. And so it'll be for those ones that we're really laying out, what do we need to bring to the table to look at? What are the factors that we think are most pivotal for that? And so in that way, you are starting at the outset from a holistic view, but you're only spending the time and energy where you really need to, because you have a lot of questions about those ones. Does that help at all?
It does help. Thanks for that. Can I a quick follow up there? I appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense the way you described it, in terms of thinking about it by the state, federal, some sort of percentage, however we decide to go down there in terms of this concept of predominance. I'm also thinking of the 10 guideline factors, and you could really go through and bin based on those as well. And so in my head, all of a sudden we have 3 times 10, 30 bins that we're talking about. And that's starting to feel a little overwhelming again. I'm probably missing something. Maybe you could explain to me again, kind of maybe why I'm being overly concerned about that.
Well, you could be a lumper or splitter throughout all of this, and I'm lumping. You know, that list of 10 factors, right, leaves leeway for the council to determine how they want to use that, to what extent, right? So I think there are some factors that, and I'm not naming specific ones, but I just have this sense that some factors are going to be more important than the others. You know, the first 2 or 3 are really pivotal, and you don't have to get into the other ones if you don't think that is relevant to your action. So I'm not envisioning that there's a bin for each species and each factor. I see groupings, right? So you think about your recreationally important stocks. Those might be ones where the ones that you have questions on, you're really looking at the 10 factors, but it's really 3 of the factors. And so those aren't your bins, but the bin is just where you need to spend more time and where there isn't already something put forward as a way, as data and information to use to inform that. So my bins are more like your analytical approach and how you're going to look at it. I don't think that you're going to split out each of the factors for each of the species, because it doesn't feel like you have to. And we have so many groupings of species that are alike that you're going to end up with the same answer as you proceed through.
Thanks for that clarification.
Thank you, Keely. Thank you, Corey. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Sharon Kiefer.
I'm just wondering, I know our action would be to adopt a scope and work plan. Adoption of the work plan would include the specificity of timelines that are currently presented to us. Yet I heard Ms. Kent kind of waffle, not waffle, but perhaps inject a little more wiggly into that regarding the, the 2 milestones. So I'm wondering if the council takes up the discussion of adoption, but with guidance perhaps about acknowledging there may be some slip with expectation of reporting back to the council if indeed there is a need for that. Just because I heard that perhaps there might be a little bit of maneuvering or opportunity. I guess what I'm trying to avoid is us locking in a lot of specificity in the timeline, and then as things slip, then we don't have a remedy to adjust that.
Keely?
Thanks for that. Yes, but perhaps I waffled. I'll take that. I was, I think, trying to meet everyone in the moment of the schedule feeling intense, overwhelming, although some feel it is not. And just noting that I think it is I appreciate the current timing. Like, I think March is the time to come back, that we will have more and that we'll have more in June. I think NIMS and council staff have really worked together well on the communication of what stage are we ready for. And so I would look to council staff, it is council staff's purview of how that is listed in terms of what the action expectation is. I think I was more trying to communicate from the NIMS standpoint. I hear those concerns about, are we going to be ready for that step in March? And so communicating that, I don't think that we're going to necessarily hold the council's feet to the fire on getting to a PPA by March, but that we are looking for forward progress and continued momentum, and that the council should determine, what step you're ready to take. But I think you have a good guide with council staff on those steps. And so I'm sure Merrick will help me out here.
Executive Director Burton.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate your concern, Ms. Kiefer. What we would intend to do is notice this in a way that doesn't, obligate the council to taking action, just like we would do if we were to say, the action under a particular item is to adopt a PPA. That doesn't mean that the council shall stay until 1 a.m. until we get a PPA done. But just that's what we're going to be hoping to achieve. And if we're not ready, then there's nothing that obligates you to that. So.
Okay. All right. Okay. I heard rumor there might be a motion maybe ready to go. Just because I don't see any hands. Look at that. Marcy, you're up, go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right. I move the council adopt the following. Number 1, the purpose and needs statement for step 1 as described in section 1.3 of the phase 2 scoping document in agenda item I-8 attachment 1. Number 2, as recommended by the GMT, I-8A supplemental GMT report 1, adopt the preliminary scope for step 1 of phase 2 as all remaining species of groundfish that have not previously been defined in other actions to identify stocks in need of conservation and management. Number 3, adopt the work plan shown in I-8 revised attachment 2. Understanding the identified timelines will require adjustment to align with council schedules and workload.
Okay. Thank you, Marcy. Is the language on the screen accurate?
Yes, it is.
Lynn for a second. Second by Lynn Mattis. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, please speak to your motion. As did.
Yes, thank you. My compliments to those that worked on the analytical document and the materials that were brought to us today for consideration. The purpose and need statement that is provided in the draft analytical document is short, clear, and very specific as to what our action is. The function of whatever the amendment is that this ultimately results in, to the council's groundfish FMP is to identify and define stocks of managed groundfish species in need of conservation and management at a geographic scale sufficient for assessing overfish status and determining if overfishing is occurring based on key biological, ecological, social, and economic information currently available. The amendment is necessary to align the FMP with the requirements of the MSA and its national standards to enhance the council's ability to attain sustainability objectives, especially those outlined in National Standard 1. There were no comments made by advisory bodies. I took that to mean that everybody felt that the purpose and need was sufficient, and it sure looks sufficient to me. Moving to number 2, the recommended scope for step 1, as all of the remaining species of groundfish that haven't previously been defined in other actions. We've had some discussion about that, and I believe in reviewing the analytical document that council staff in conjunction with NIMS felt that this was the best path forward for step 1 to bring them all forward, all the remaining stocks forward or species forward for consideration. The GMT spent some time thinking about that and concurred with that advice, and so just want to thank them for identifying that and agreeing that the remaining stock should all go forward in this next step 1 together. Number 3 on the work plan, what I really appreciate here is that the elements of the plan are very clearly outlined and defined. We heard a lot about the timelines. A lot of concern with timelines. I think the reality is, as reflected in the discussion we just had, that there may be some adjustments necessary to align council schedules and workload. But I do appreciate there may be some different schools of thought. Maybe we can go as fast as the timeline suggests at the moment, but there may be real reasons for scheduling purposes and such that we just can't quite stay on track. But I think that the key items, the content, the specific tasks that are identified and outlined in attachment 2 are definitely outline our path forward.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you.
Any questions for the motion maker? Discussion on the motion? Everybody's tired? Want the question? I'll ask it. Okay. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. Abstentions? All right. Motion passed unanimously. Wonderful. Okay. Todd?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe we have a path forward by that motion, and we will get to work on it immediately. I will note that in the purpose and need, we do have the 3 letters TBD for the amendment, and we will adjust that as we move forward into an actual number. But other than that, we will get to work ASAP. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great work, everybody. Gonna take a break. Probably a good 10-minute break here, and we'll come back to K1 fiscal matters to finish the day off. So. Okay. With that music, we're primed for fiscal matters. Good job, Greg. Welcome back, everyone. We're jumping ahead to K1 for tomorrow to get it off tomorrow's docket. And so with that, I'll turn to Patricia to get us going here. Patricia.
Good afternoon, Chair and Council. The Budget Committee met last Wednesday and received a status update on the Council's current funding, the 2023 audit results, and the status of IRA funding, and the 2025 no-cost extension proposal. The committee also discussed a revision to the Council Operating Procedure 9, Schedule 7. For consideration of this agenda item, the following attachments are available. Attachment 1 is the Budget Committee agenda. Attachment 2 is Executive Director's Report. Attachment 3 is the draft COP revisions. And agenda item K1A, Supplemental Budget Committee Report 1.
All right. Thank you. With that, I'll turn to our Budget Committee Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll pivot right back to Patricia Hearing to read the Budget Committee report into the record, please.
All right. Agenda item K1, Supplemental Budget Committee Report 1. The Pacific Fishery Management Council Budget Committee met on Wednesday, September 18th to receive information regarding the Council's 2024 status of funding, the 2023 audit results, 2024 budget and expenditures through August 31st, the calendar year 2025 staff proposed provisional budget, and the 2025 no-cost extension narrative and budget. The committee also reviewed proposed changes to the Council Operating Procedure 9, Schedule 7. National Marine Fisheries Service, West Coast Region Sustainable Fisheries Division Budget Update. Mr. Brian Wolf noted that the continuing resolutions are being discussed in both the House and the Senate to fund the government for the initial part of the fiscal year. In the event a continuing resolution is not in place, NIMS will be part of the government shutdown. This is not expected to impact the council directly. Future NIMS budget information depends on when final appropriations are available. Executive Director's Report. Mr. Burden reviewed the 2024 fiscal expectations and noted that all 2024 funds expected have been received to date. This includes initial funding from the Inflation Reduction Act grant, with a second allocation expected before the end of the calendar year. Budgeted financial expectations at 2024 year end of $1.9 million would result in the no-cost extension for 2025. The 2023 audit results were reviewed, and it was noted that the audit complies with the federal account audit standards, and there are no non-compliance issues in the financial statements. The audit notes that we were not a low-risk auditee due to the prior audit finding in 2021. Prior changes have been implemented to prevent future occurrences, which led to the 2021 audit finding. Mr. Burden provided proposed revisions to the COP 9, Schedule 7. These minor revisions are intended to align with current Department of Commerce grant policies. Mr. Burden presented the committee with a proposed 2025 budget with details that relate to the 3 expected funding sources and requested the committee focus on the no-cost extension portion since the request for extension is due before the next council meeting. The extension funds are primarily used to support projects that are continuing from 2024 and will provide an opportunity to support council infrastructure. Currently, the preliminary provisional 2025 budget is just under $6.8 million, which is an increase of $200,000 over the 2024 budget. Budget Committee discussion on activities. The Budget Committee elected Pete Hasmer to serve as chair and Mark Gorelnik to serve as vice chair for the current year. The BC discussed the COP revisions and supported the changes, but modified the document to add the word administrative to identify the type of grant. The Budget Committee discussed the proposed preliminary annual budget and had no recommendations for changes at this time, and will review the proposed budget again in November and make a recommendation to the council then. The committee discussed several other matters, including the movement of meetings to a remote format and associated budget implications. The BC also discussed the apparent downsizing of staff and capacity that is occurring across partner agencies of the council and the impact this will have on council committees and working groups. BC members expressed concern and noted the need to prioritize work and be clear about roles and responsibilities within the council process in light of changing personnel and related capacity. The BC further discussed the council's IRA projects and inquired whether and when a more detailed discussion of IRA projects could take place. State members of the BC indicated they are recently notified that NIMS has reduced funding to Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission for work with the Pacific Fishery Information Network, PACFIN. Mr. Wolf noted that NIMS discretionary funds are unknown until 2025 appropriations are complete. Budget Committee recommendations: approve the 2023 audit results, recommend the changes to COP 9 Schedule 7 with the inclusion of the word administrative to identify the type of grant, and approve the no-cost extension narrative and budget. And that completes the report.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay. Discussion on the financial report. Sharon Kiefer.
Mr. Chairman, not to cut off any discussion, but when the time is appropriate, I do have a motion.
Wonderful. All right. Heather Hall.
Thank you, Chair Pettinger. And I just wanted to add on the report, I appreciate the discussion at the Budget Committee. I wasn't there on the reduced PACFIN money that the states are getting, and just wanted to share the implication this has in some context, you know, what it does. And we were talking about this in the stock assessment agenda item about age rating, and we provide that to our agency, and this means that we will be able to do less of that. And so just wanted to put it in a context of what exactly that means. So thank you.
Lynn Mavis.
Thank you, Chair. On that similar vein, not heard directly, but I've heard from our staff that these budget reductions may also be affecting RecFin, which is the Recreational Fisheries Information Network. Maybe not as much as PACFIN, but the budget we are getting for our recreational sampling program is also being reduced. Doesn't impact our action here, but I thought it was just a good note as we move forward.
Gotcha. Okay. What else? Probably should make sure before we move on, we public comment, confirm with Tower. Okay, very good. All right. So, all right. No one else? Sharon Kiefer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move the council adopt the recommendations of the Budget Committee presented in Agenda Item K1A, Supplemental Budget Committee Report 1, Report of the Budget Committee on Fiscal Matters.
Okay, the language on the screen accurate?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is.
Very good. Second by Butch Smith. Thank you, Butch. All right, we'll need to speak to that. So, any discussion? All right, call for the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Abstentions? All right, motion passed unanimously. Wonderful. Great work by the staff, by the way, Fiscal Matters. Good work, Patricia. So, all right. Before we leave here today, remind everybody that tomorrow is suit and tie. Well, just kidding. It's day last. Day last is day last. So, but I'm going to turn to Executive Director Burden here for any announcements or planning for tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very good work today, everyone. Just a quick note before you do take off for the evening, we do have, per usual process, we have a revised year-at-a-glance summary and a revised quick reference agenda for the November meeting. And just for the newer council members, what happens throughout the week is that Kelly and I and the staff officers and the admin folks, we take note of your discussions and we update the schedule looking out throughout the year accordingly, and we try to update the next council meeting schedule too. So you'll see a new batch of planning documents essentially. So take a look at those before we get to tomorrow, and those will be posted to the web very soon if they're not already. Other than that, I do not have any other remarks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Burden. All right, well, have a great night, and we'll see you a little later. So, all right. Bye.